community takes to the requirements that are imposed upon it.
Thank you very much indeed. Our third speaker is Oana Mihalache, who is who works at Roma Rrights as the head of their human rights department, and Oana has a long history really of working from the grassroots up, using her community organizing experience and her knowledge of Roma conditions on the ground to inform very high level advocacy and litigation. So it's one of the really distinctive features, I think, about Roma Rrights, that not only the staff of the organization is so expert, but that the strategy that they use is so well imbricated with the lives of the community they serve. So it really brings a very rich fact picture, so to speak, to the litigation. So Oana, thank you for joining us and for telling us a bit about the school segregation situation.
Thank you. Allow me firstly to congratulate Roma on the occasion of our International Day, But Bărshangle Romale. Many thanks to all initiators of this conference. I am truly honored to share the panel with such remarkable speakers. Last week, on the 4th of April, Roma Rrights had a multiple motivation to celebrate: the International Roma Day, which we marked a few days earlier, as well as 20 years of activity since Roma Rrights was founded. It was a moment of anniversary and celebration, but also a moment of reflection of what exactly has changed for Roma in the past 20 years. The reflection indicated that not much has changed, unfortunately. Take as an example Roma school segregation, which is quite a widespread phenomenon in Europe. The recent data indicate the high presence of school segregation of Roma children in countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and others. Although cases have been identified since so many years ago, and the public authorities have been constantly alerted by civil society, the situation remains alarming and little progress is visible. Roma Rrights solely has identified and documented more than 20 cases of school segregation in the past years. There have been different stages in the process of fighting school segregation, from the efforts to prove to authorities and to have these officially acknowledge the existence of the phenomenon, to adopting legislation which prohibits segregation, and to the issue of changing the attitudes and perceptions of the parents. Apart from the discriminatory physical separation, Roma school segregation comes together in the majority of cases with poor quality of education. A study conducted by Roma Rrights in Romania in 2011 indicates that segregation is more often encountered in primary school, where 64.5% of Roma students learn in segregated classes, while its middle school percentage is 53%. In primary school, 9.8% of Roma students learn in all Roma classes and 9.56% in middle school. The situation is different from 15 years ago only in the sense that authorities have become aware of the phenomenon, either as a result of the civil society's efforts, as in Romania, either as a result of clear decisions of the European Court of Human Rights condemning states for segregation cases, such as the Czech Republic, Croatia, Greece, and more recently, Hungary. However, the acknowledgement of Roma school segregation doesn't always come from the side of local authorities, which are in this case the most relevant, school units managers or teachers. This is in fact an obstacle to researchers' attempt to give an overview on the scale of school segregation. Most teachers, when being interviewed on this topic, would state there is no school segregation, which is actually their way to hide the reality, either because they prefer to show things in a good light, either from fear of sanctions. Regardless of the awareness of the phenomenon, the situation remains worrying. School segregation has appeared in different contexts, depending from country to country. Sometimes it was a case of government's policy to form different Roma classes in order to prepare Roma students to better integrate in the society, while in some countries it was the response of school units to non-Roma parents' requests to avoid having their children learning in the same school unit as Roma children. Further, school segregation is associated with residential segregation very often. School segregation is manifested in different forms, which are common for all European countries where this phenomenon is encountered. Roma children are enrolled in separate schools, separate buildings, belonging to the same school, or to separate classes. A very serious form of Roma school segregation is the enrollment of Roma children in special schools as a result of abusive diagnosis as children with special educational needs or with mental disabilities. Regardless of its causes or forms, school segregation is a serious threat to human dignity and to the principle of equal access to education. Its impact manifests on a very long term, and it reflects not only on the Roma children, but on their families as a whole as well. Not enjoying the same school benefits as non-Roma children has negative effects on the employment opportunities as well as on their entire future. It is a fact that Roma students in segregated classes have a significantly higher risk of illiteracy. A study shows that around 15% of pupils in classes with a majority of Roma children are illiterate, compared to around 4% of the other Roma students. Although mechanisms to address school segregation exist, until present, these have failed to prove significant efficiency. For example, Romani Cris has used documented cases of school segregation to lobby the authorities, jointly with other representatives of the civil society in Romania, to adopt specific legislation to combat school segregation. However, almost 6 years after the adoption of this piece of legislation, its results are very weak in terms of implementation. In spite of the significant number of European Court of Human Rights decisions on the Roma school segregation against Czech Republic, I repeat, Croatia, Greece, and Hungary, significant changes haven't been achieved. This is clearly the case for the DH and others versus Czech Republic, as a joint NGO submission to the Committee of Ministry from November 2012 states. 5 years after the European Court of Human Rights decision, in the Czech Republic, Roma children are still segregated, including in one school where one of the DH plaintiffs studied. How come, after quite several European Court of Human Rights decisions, after so many years of efforts in combating Roma school segregation, so low results are visible? First of all, for many cases, those who struggle to contribute to the eradication of this phenomenon don't actually know what the extent of it is. This is the result of the education system's failure to collect data on this. Although it is crucial to have initial data before starting to work on combating segregation plans, this doesn't happen, not even in those countries where the law requests for periodical data collection, such as Romania. Secondly, those who are directly responsible for creating school segregation situations are never properly sanctioned. The local communities are quiet. There is a lack of initiative coming from Roma parents, dissatisfied with the quality of education their children benefit from. On the other side, there are common initiatives of non-Roma parents who won't accept their children to learn in the same school unit as Roma. The voices of the non-Roma parents are always the ones to be heard by the decision makers. In fact, this is one of the primary factors mentioned by school managers or teachers when motivating Roma school segregation. The most important signal against Roma school segregation should come from Roma parents. However, taking into account the officials' reluctance to hearing Roma needs and requests, these efforts should be doubled by governments. Not tolerating this practice, adopting legislative measures to combat and prevent it, and taking strong measures of condemning the existing situation represent the minimal steps which need to be taken in order to start a long-term process of eliminating this serious form of discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Oana. Our next speaker is Morton Karam, who I think for anyone who's worked in the human rights field really needs no introduction. He's now the director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, a very significant an important body with really a transformative obligation in this current climate within the EU. Prior to this position, Morten, I think, founded and directed the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which really became one of the leading voices on human rights in Europe, starting from my tiny origins, became really one of the most impressive and influential human rights bodies. So he's really been a transformative thinker in this field. And we're delighted he's going to come and talk to us a bit about, from the EU perspective, of how issues relating to Roma rights can be advanced. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for these nice words. And thanks a lot for a very great initiative you have taken here, also together with our friends from ODIHR. We also collaborate a lot with back home in Vienna. And it's always nice, I think, when we sort of someone wants to take the time and look at Europe from outside. So it's nice to take the flight across the Atlantic and then look back and actually see what does it look from here. And I look very much forward to the discussion. But let me start with a quote. When we see that a Romani family is incapable of providing the kind of education, the kind of quality upbringing that guarantees their child a culture, then someone else has to do it. This was a recent statement made by the Slovak Prime Minister, proposing what he termed extreme measures for improving the education of Roma children, namely that they would be mandatorily educated at boarding schools, or you could also say forcefully removed from their parents. The Slovak government commissioner for the Roma community disagreed, and also together with the Ministry of Interior is now trying to reform education policies based on intensive work with Roma children starting at a very young age, 3 years, and linked to the nursery schools. Only a few days ago, the relevant Hungarian minister recommended that the immediate dismissal of a history teacher who spoke publicly in favor of corporal punishment for Roma children. The minister took this decisive step of dismissing the teacher, although his decision, the minister's decision, was very controversial in a political environment heavily influenced by anti-Roma rhetoric. These are just two of very many examples that show the political upheaval generated by the intensified efforts to find ways in Europe of improving Roma inclusion. EU governments are gradually starting to implement their national Roma inclusion strategies, and of course in the national strategies the field of education that we're here to discuss is one of the cornerstones. The exclusion, as we have also heard from other speakers, in particular Oana, that the exclusion of many Roma children from quality education is a key element in the vicious circle of poverty and marginalization that affects Roma across the EU today. This can result from discriminatory practices, but also from parental choices. Exclusion from education takes a number of different forms, from blunt refusal to enroll Roma children under pressure, as we just heard, from non-Roma parents, to placement in special schools or ethnically segregated classes. Ethnic segregation is the result of various factors, ranging from residential issues to anti-Roma prejudice. Residential segregation leads to schools with a high concentration of Roma children, if there are no provisions established to actually transport the children to other schools in other districts. But also mechanisms within the education system can also push towards the ethnic segregation. For example, in countries where parents are given the choice, a free choice of which public school to choose for their children, and then they can avoid explicitly enrolling them in schools with a high share of Roma pupils. This behavior is referred to as white flight. On the other hand, there is some research evidence also suggesting that a number of Roma parents may also actually prefer to place their children in predominantly Roma schools. They may fear that their children can be discriminated against in the mixed schools, or simply because they feel that the so-called Roma schools will be less demanding. Whatever the reasons are, as was also underlined by Professor Greenberg, from a human rights perspective, clearly ethnic segregation is unacceptable, as was also stressed by the European Court of Human Rights in the landmark decision from 2007. Last year, the Fundamental Rights Agency, the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, published the result of the largest survey to date on Roma in Europe, which was conducted in very close and very strong collaboration with UNDP and the World Bank. It was a bit of a struggle, I would say, to bring UNDP on, not on board. UNDP was very keen on it, but to get it accepted in a European context, that we suddenly have the UN Development Program looking at issues inside Europe. But I think we're moving, so to say, seeing that we can also learn from some of those perspectives. But also with the World Bank on board was also extremely useful. We surveyed more than 80,000 Roma and their non-Roma neighbors. They were surveyed in 11 countries, the 11 countries where we find the largest concentration of Roma. And it was based on randomly selected household samples. So it was face-to-face interviews with from 1 to 2 hours each. So a wealth of information we have here. So anyone who's eager to dig into a very nice pool of data, please make yourself known and we can talk about it. We simply can't deal with all that data, and there's so much richness. On top of the Roma and non-Roma, we also interviewed 300 municipalities to see what are they doing, what are they not doing. But just in relation to a few highlights in relation to education. On average, around 20% of Roma aged 16 and above, so 20% of the Roma could not read and write. And in contrast, the neighbors, the majority population living around them, the same was 1.5%, 1.5%. 1.5 up against 20%. Only half of the Roma children attended preschool or kindergarten compared to around 75% of the non-Roma neighbors. In some countries, up to 35% of the Roma children between 7 and 15 were not attending compulsory school education, so where they are in the period of life where it's compulsory. And finally, only about 15% of young Roma had completed any form of upper secondary, general or vocational education, compared to around 65% of their majority population neighbors. So this is the type of hard statistical evidence that can provide vital assistance to governments in designing evidence-based policy also within this area. And I firmly believe that is somewhat what we have lacked, is sort of the more detailed data in order to make more targeted policies. And of course, the data confirms that much still needs to be done to ensure that Roma are equally treated. After the accession of the 10 Central and Eastern European countries to the EU, a number of Roma from the southeast migrated to countries such as France, Italy, UK, Finland, Germany, and others in search for a better life. However, their inability to find employment, mainly due to lack of education, discrimination at the labor market, and their poor living conditions, led to conflicts in some of the member states. And some of you will recall the clash between the EU Commission and France in the summer of 2010, which really brought the whole Roma issue to the center stage of political attention in Europe. This led to the EU Commission in April 2011 to present an EU framework for national Roma integration strategies up to 2020. There was a realization that Europe has to move much more focused in this regard. So it was linked to the EU 2020 economic or growth strategy. However, there was another profound paradigm shift, and that was that the same strategy is also anchored in the Fundamental Rights Charter. So there is a very clear human rights dimension for the first time linked to the European Roma strategies. In this context of the Roma strategy, the EU asked member states to take action in the area of employment, education, housing, and health. These 4 areas became the target by putting in place concrete strategies that identify special national, regional, and very local action plans with dedicated funding to it as well. The Fundamental Rights Agency was tasked with assisting these efforts by continuing to collect data systematically, because as it was said before, we need data in order to see, are we moving ahead or what is happening. But not only by collecting data, but also by helping governments, the member states, to establish effective monitoring mechanism. So we now are convening a working group of 11 member states where we are assisting them in establishing a national monitoring mechanism to measure progress. And finally, also by sharing promising practice from our surveys. The EU framework on Roma inclusion set some clear benchmarks, and let me just highlight a few of them. Member states should set as a minimum, or should as a minimum ensure primary school completion. Secondly, they should also widen access to quality early childhood education and care, and reduce the number of early school leavers from secondary education pursuant to the Europe 2020 strategy. And Roma youngsters should be strongly encouraged to participate also in secondary education. And here again, our data is coming in as sort of giving the benchmark, being the baseline, so we can actually see whether progress is taking place. I find myself that these are ambitious targets, not only in the context of the ongoing economic crisis, but also because, as we have heard, Roma inclusion have to tackle and address the profound prejudice and emotionally charged tensions that we find in Europe when it comes to Roma in Europe. Let me just sort of say, in winding up, highlight very briefly, three key areas where from our surveys we can see that there may be at least possible moves forward. Firstly, early childhood education and care must be improved. Research shows that children who do not participate in preschool education are disadvantaged from the very beginning of their school career. Governments and local authorities should therefore make a systematic effort to engage with and convince Roma parents of the importance of early childhood education, providing them with the necessary practical support to allow their children to attend. Secondly, compulsory schooling in non-segregated settings is a precondition. Systematic efforts should be made with local and school authorities and parents, both Roma and non-Roma parents, to ensure that all Roma children participate on an equal footing in compulsory education. It's fascinating when we look at all the surveys we have done on Roma and read them, so to say, the promising practice horizontally, and see, is there a common denominator for promising practice? And then I say, yes, there is one common denominator, and that is you may have success if you engage Roma from the beginning, and very often also their neighbors, the people around them. If you don't do it, you're bound to fail. But if you do it, there is a chance that you will have success. It's one of these low-hanging fruits that unfortunately when we ask the municipalities, we can see, it's not very often done. So in some EU countries, the third one is that we also need to focus on Roma gaining marketable skills as a key component. In some countries, as we heard in the opening in the zero panel, up to a quarter of the workforce entering the labor market within the coming years will be Roma. So it's a very big proportion of the workforce entering. And if they are entering without proper skills, proper education, we will simply have a very big problem just filling our workplaces. So we cannot afford to ignore this challenge. So it's therefore essential that educational authorities develop well-funded action plans to ensure that a rising proportion of Roma youngsters benefit from post-compulsory education and training. And this must be linked to appropriate employment schemes. So the problems, as also Amartya said, faced by Roma are complex and call for an integrated approach in order to simultaneously address low educational attainment, labor market barriers, segregation in education and in housing, and poor health outcomes. Implementing such changes is the responsibility, as we've also heard, of national, regional, and especially local governments. And there we have a big challenge. They don't really see that they have a human rights, a fundamental rights obligation, that they are accountable. But of course also the EU has an important role to play, improving legislation against discrimination, coordinating policy, setting common integration goals, and of course providing funding. A vast amount of the funding available today is simply not being used. I just visit one member state with big issues, and only around under 20% of the funding available had been tapped into. So there is, at least for the moment, funding available. Anyhow, I would like to end on a positive note. Today we have evidence on Roma inclusion. To give you just one example from the area of education. Our surveys show that when you do household surveys, you have the older, the not so old, and then all the way down. So you sort of can say the generational changes, and that can also illustrate change, or let's say impact of policies. And here we, for example, in Spain, can see that only today the young people, only 1% of those aged between 16 and 24 never attended school. If we ask their parents, those older than 45 years, it was approximately half of them who had never attended school. So it's a big step from half of them not having attended school to now around 1%. So I think we can conclude that something has worked. Exactly what, but let's sort it out and let's do more of that and less of what has not worked. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Morten. So our last but not least speaker is Roberta Gotti, who is a social protection sector manager and also lead human development economist for the Middle East and North Africa region from the World Bank, an accomplished economist who has a wide portfolio at the World Bank. Looks like a very integrative portfolio, bringing together a range of critical issues, amongst which Roma inclusion is one. So we're delighted to have you with us, Roberta. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhabha, and I have to say that it's not an easy task to be the last speaker in such a distinguished series of panelists, so I'll be brief. I was asked to speak about segregation in education, and we all recognize that education is only one of the one element of the many entangled dimensions of exclusion, like Professor Amartya Sen indicated before, for Roma people. School segregation for Roma is pervasive, and Dr. Mihalache already gave us a very nice sense and quite astonishing sense of how deeply entrenched school segregation is in Romania. The World Bank engaged with the Fundamental Rights Agency, with the UNDP and the Economic Commission to collect this broad household multi-topic survey in a number of European countries, both Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that have significant Roma populations. So if you hear me cite statistics that Dr. Kjaerum has already cited, is because we are looking at the same data, and that means that not very much our data is available to study Roma issue. And this is, if I had to put just one plea, that is one that I think is essential for us to be able to create rigorous evidence and awareness about Roma issue to generate good quality data. So I was saying school segregation is pervasive, and from this data what comes forth is that between 20% to 50% of Roma children in primary and secondary schooling says, I'm attending a school where there are mostly Roma children. Dr. Mihalache also spoke about the prevalence of the practice of streaming Roma children in special education schooling. And this practice in some countries is actually on the rise. We looked at data for Slovakia, and we found that currently 12% of Roma pupils, Roma students, are in special education schools, while only 6% of those who are currently 30-year-old, or let's say 1 generation ago, were in special schools. School segregation is pervasive, but is a very costly practice. It's very costly to have children who do not need it to be in special education, and there is a mounting evidence from the education literature that shows that being in an integrated learning environment is productive for learning outcomes. Particularly because what can happen is that in segregating schoolings, expectation can be lowered, and there is much evidence that also is based on the racial divide within the United States that has brought forward this element. Segregation is also unjustified and unjustifiable. There is a very interesting study from the Roma Education Fund that follows children from families who left the Czech Republic and Slovakia to move to England. Their children were in segregated schooling, but then they turned out to perform at par with their peers quite rapidly, speak fully fluently English once in England. And only between, I think, 2 to 4% were actually deemed to need special education. So there's much that could be said about school segregation, but what I would like to focus my 29 seconds on, which are probably now 27, on one, let's say, opportunity rather than challenge. And this opportunity is really one instrument for integration, which is early childhood development intervention, something that Dr. Kjaerum has already pointed out as an essential intervention point for policy. So there is mounting evidence that early childhood development is associated with better learning outcomes for children, for all children, but particularly for Roma children. We looked at numeracy and literacy of children from 5 onward, and the ones who had been able to attend preschool did dramatically better than others. Those who attended preschool were much more likely to complete secondary schooling and much less likely to be streamed into special education, particularly in countries that still have an entry exam at age 6 for the children to be streamed into general education or special schools. Despite these tremendous benefits to early childhood development, there is still a tremendous unequal access to preschooling. From the data of this that we collected in this survey, we found that the gap between Roma and non-Roma children is particularly large in countries such as Slovakia or the Czech Republic, where there is a 50% points difference between Roma and non-Roma children. And what we are talking about for the sampling of the survey was Roma and their non-Roma neighbors, which means that a lot of the sort of socioeconomic and environmental characteristics are already controlled for, and we are sort of comparing, in sort of layman terms, apples with apples, so to speak. Clearly, I mentioned earlier that early childhood development is tremendously productive for all children, but it's particularly productive from disadvantaged children. Actually, Jim Heckman, another Nobel Prize winner who has fostered the cause of the importance of early childhood development, says investing in disadvantaged young children is a rare public policy that has no equity efficiency trade-off. Again, in layman terms, this is a win-win. It is a win-win that is really not happening yet for Roma children. And these inequalities that happen early in life, they continue to perpetuate themselves. And what we see and what we observe across countries is that Roma children, as they go on in their student path, they are much less likely, anywhere between 2 to 4 times less likely than non-Roma to graduate from secondary schooling. However, and very interesting, from this very survey, we learned that Roma parents have exactly the same preferences as non-Roma parents in terms of education. So it's really a question of the socioeconomic background and the marginalization of Roma families that is conducive to these differences rather than parental preferences. The importance of bridging the employability gap has already been brought up, and it could not be stressed enough. Investing in employability for Roma people is also a question of smart economics. In countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia that are rapidly aging, Roma people are the labor force of the future. And this is the labor force that will contribute to economic growth, that will contribute to fiscal revenue. So even from sort of the bleak economist perspective, investing in Roma is investing in everyone's welfare. So if I were to summarize like three pressure points where we might want to promote and support interventions from governments, help governments understand how they could do it, definitely increase early childhood development, which encompasses not only early childhood education from the 3 to 6 range, but also interventions from the -9 months to the 3 years of age, which we all know are the most fertile for learning and cognitive development. This is really a key issue and can be done both with in-school education, but also with improved home parenting. And there are initial pilots that really show already good results. And for example, again, to cite the pilot from the Roma Education Fund, A Good Start, which works, I think, in 16 communities in different countries, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia. These are a sort of an all-encompassing interventions that bring in the community, increase awareness, help parents to be better parents, provide materials such as toys and books, which are often lacking in families that live in disadvantaged conditions, to improve cognitive development for children. Clearly moving from early childhood development towards primary schooling, it's essential to move towards an integrate